Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar in the SERDP and ESTCP webinar series. My name is Rula Deeb. I'm a Senior Principal at Geosyntac Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's call. The webinar will consist of a brief overview of SERDP and ESTCP by Dr. Kurt Preston, followed by a list of upcoming webinars in this series. After Dr. Preston's opening remarks, we will transition to the technical portion of the webinar. Today's event features an award-winning project within the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area. Dr. Julian Olden will be the only presenter and will pause halfway through his presentation to entertain questions from our audience. We will conclude the webinar with a second question and answer session. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of your screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we do encourage you to submit questions well in advance of the Q&A sessions. On this slide, we have provided a few suggestions in the event that you experience difficulties with the broadcast audio. Typically, any delay will be fixed if you refresh your screen or call into the conference line. However, if you continue to have problems, please submit a comment using the chat box in the lower left corner of the screen. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Kurt Preston, who recently joined SERDP and ESTCP as the Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resiliency. As such, he acts as the focal point for this program area that supports development of the science, technologies, and methods needed to sustain DoD environmental infrastructure. Dr. Preston has tracked his career between academic and military positions, and has served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and as a member of the Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board. With that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Kurt.
Thank you, Rula. I'm happy to welcome everyone today to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. It was established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on Department of Defense requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impacts real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP and other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs. With much of SERDP research occurring in the lab and at pilot scale, with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, although occasionally supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are 4 program areas in SERDP and 5 in ESTCP. The Energy and Water Program area is only found in ESTCP, while the other 4, Environmental Restoration, Munitions Response, Resource Conservation and Resiliency, and weapons, systems, and platforms are found both in SERDP and ESTCP programs and managed jointly by a single designated program manager. Our webinar today is focusing on research and demonstrations that were conducted under the Resource Conservation and Resiliency program area. Areas of investment include understanding Department of Defense relevant ecological systems, assessing the impact of military training on marine mammals, managing threatened, endangered, and at-risk species and invasive species, understanding watershed processes and management, developing the models and tools necessary to understand infrastructure vulnerabilities to and the impacts from climate change, and understanding the impact to air quality from Department of Defense activities. Our webinar series will be highlighting research and demonstration efforts from each of the 5 program areas. We have launched a new mini-series in 2017, which includes today's webinar to highlight research findings from SERDP and ESTCP award-winning projects. As you can see, upcoming webinars will cover a broad range of topics, including monitoring and risk assessments of environmental risks posed by munition constituents in aquatic systems, 1,4-dioxane cleanup technologies at DoD contaminated sites, solutions for installations participation in energy markets, and novel coating systems for use as high-performance, chemical-resistant power top coats. You can find more information about upcoming webinars at this link, and registration is now live for webinars through May 2017. I am pleased to announce that for the first time since 2011, the SERDP ESTCP Symposium will be held next November in Washington, D.C. The 3-day event will showcase the latest technologies that enhance DoD's missions through improved environmental and energy performance. Registration information will be available soon on the SERDP ESTCP website. Again, mark your calendars for this coming November in Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoy the webinar today.
Thank you, Kurt. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Julian Olden, who is a professor in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences and co-director of the Center for Creative Conservation, both at the University of Washington. Broadly motivated by a future where people recognize and respect the diverse values provided by functioning freshwater ecosystems, Dr. Olden seeks in his research to integrate science-based approaches with on-the-ground management and conservation decisions. He has authored over 180 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. His academic background includes a bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto in 1998, a master's degree from the University of Toronto in 2000, and finally a doctorate in 2004 from the Colorado State University. With that, I turn it over to you, Julian.
Great. Thank you very much, Rula. Thank you, Kurt, also for this opportunity to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing funded by SERDP down in the southwestern United States. I want to thank everyone who's on the call as well for spending some time to talk a little bit about amphibians in a drying climate. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about ways in which we can visualize or understand changing hydrology in arid systems and what this means for the connectivity, that is kind of how connected different habitats are in these environments. We're going to be using or looking at how landscape genetics provides a lens upon which we can try to understand what the implications of this habitat connectivity and fragmentation means for biological communities. And I'll be talking a little bit about amphibians and aquatic insects within this context. And then also trying to find ways in which we can generalize individual species studies to entire communities in the sense that detailed landscape genetic studies are often precluded for many species, and traits might provide one currency to try to generalize across landscapes. And all of this will be kind of within this context of how do we identify the challenges and opportunities to better manage our resources on military lands as well as surrounding lands. So the motivation is essentially this. Dryland systems, so I'm going to use that term to refer to ephemeral and intermittent streams, so streams that only flow during certain times of the year and often only in response to precipitation events, are really the dominant river type across the United States. The figure to the right there shows just the percent of intermittent streams from major watersheds, so you can see that in fact they are the rule and not the exception with respect to aquatic systems. So the motivation of this research was to really try to understand, what are the hydrologic dynamics of these different streams in areas of the southwestern United States, and how did these systems provide critical habitats as well as connect different aspects of the landscape in ways in which can support aquatic species now and into the future. So ephemeral and intermittent streams really exist in this precarious balance between drying and flooding. So regional precipitation is often characterized by infrequent thunderstorm events in the summer during the monsoon times, as well as low intensity winter storms. And this can result in prolonged drought periods in which systems are dry, as the top right figure shows, which could then suddenly be interrupted by high flow events, the same system shown just 3 days later in response to a precipitation event. So it's this precarious balance, which is both important to study, but also critically important because it shapes the ecological processes and the distribution of organisms and their persistence across the landscape. So dry riverbeds are often wet, and in both cases, these types of habitats are critically important for supporting biodiversity on and surrounding military lands. What's also clear in the American Southwest is that habitat loss is an ongoing challenge, particularly as perennial waters become more and more limited, and they're often appropriated for human use, and groundwater pumping often results in the continued reduction of these habitats in terms of surface water availability, thus pushing many of these systems from perennial to intermittent, in some cases ephemeral states. Today I'm going to be bringing you to a beautiful place on the earth, quite honestly. The study region that we looked at is the Madrean Sky Islands of southeastern Arizona. In fact, it's a biodiversity hotspot globally, in large part because it's characterized by many mountain ranges separated by arid valley shrublands. So there's a remarkable amount of heterogeneity, both in terms of elevation, water permanence, precipitation, and vegetation and temperature. So today I'm going to be really focusing in on this region right here. I'll be talking a lot about the Huachuca Mountains, but then also the surrounding areas, including the Santa Rita Mountains, the Whetstones, Dragoon, and the Mule Mountains. So these are all these sky islands which I'll be focusing on. But in particularly, I'll be talking about the patterns that we're seeing on Fort Huachuca shown here. So Fort Huachuca really has strong gradients with respect to elevation. It's also uniquely situated close to or in the valley of the San Pedro River. Sierra Vista is shown right here, and it's essentially on these northern and eastern flanks of where the study system is. As I mentioned, the Huachuca Mountains are a beautiful area. This is after a hike upriver looking down into the valley. So you can see that there's a large amount of heterogeneous environments which are critical for supporting biodiversity. And there's strong hydrologic gradients. So this is showing Ramsey and Garden Canyon, which are two systems on and surrounding Fort Huachuca. These are the perennial headwater streams and can often be quite lush and also receive snow during certain times of the year. As we move downstream, we get typically a transition into more intermittent systems shown here, where this stream will be only flowing for particular times of the year. And then as we go out into the alluvial fan, we'll often pick up more intermittent and ephemeral streams as shown here. One of the challenges with understanding how these systems essentially light up with respect to flowing water or go dry is really that they occur at very small time scales. And currently, the way in which we keep our finger on the pulse of hydrology is typically through the USGS gauge network, which is only in certain watersheds and only in one place. So in this study, we're interested in really doing a detailed monitoring of the stream flow timing throughout Fort Huachuca by using a field-based deployment of electrical resistance sensors. These sensors essentially monitor the stream bed saturation, and we can use this to infer the timing of flow at 15-minute intervals. These sensors are relatively inexpensive. We can deploy them on or above the sediment surface, and as the figure shows to the right, you can actually have an entire array of them across the landscape. So what I'm showing here in black is Fort Huachuca, and each of the red dot is a surface flow sensor, which we distributed across these watersheds. So a lot of the major watersheds basically start, or are the inference is that they flow in the headwaters, and as they move downstream, they typically come more dry. So the first thing that we were interested in was deploying these throughout the river network. So we deployed sensors starting in the headwaters and moving downstream. These were essentially deployed on the riverbed. This is the sensor right here. It's a modified temperature logger. I honestly think this provides a real great ability for all military bases and dryland systems to really keep their finger on the pulse of these resources, which is currently not being provided by the kind of the rare distribution of USGS gauges. So these were lashed to trees and embedded in the substrate. Some of the high flow events that occur through these systems requires us to really keep them tied down with that so we don't lose them. These are just quickly some of the results I can show. These are three canyons, which are just major canyons, Ramsey, Garden, and Huachuca Canyon. What's really interesting is that each one of these dots shown here is the percent of time throughout the year in which water is present. So you can see in general, there's some perennial systems where 100% of the time water is flowing, but as you move downstream, you can see it becomes much more rare. And you can see in some cases only 50% of the time here in Garden Canyon, or only 3% of the time flowing water. So you can see we have a really strong hydrologic gradient, typically starting in perennial waters, in the headwaters, and then becoming more ephemeral as you go downstream. This is actually the flip-flop of most other river systems throughout the United States and temperate systems where the opposite pattern occurs. What's also interesting is that what I've shown here is just how connected these landscapes are. That is, what percent of time is the entire river all flowing. And you can see that varies greatly from about 41% all the way down to 0. So the degree at which organisms can move through the river because of fully connected water is actually quite rare, and it's very sporadic. So we know that these dryland systems are going to be facing climate changes in the future. In blue is the present day mean precipitation record for Sierra Vista, which is again right at the doorstep of Fort Huachuca. But in red is just one of many future projections. And three things I just want to illustrate here. When we look to the future, there's a strong indication that we're going to have dampened interannual variability through time. We expect that we're going to have a decrease in magnitude of flows during the monsoon period because of decreased precipitation. But then we might also have more increased early winter events. All of this is really going to be affecting the hydrologic patterns across the system. And how might it do this? Well, this is one result of some modeling that we did, rain runoff modeling that we did for Garden Canyon, One Canyon. I'm just going to guide you along here. This is present day going from upstream on the left to downstream. And as you go from blue to red, you have a more and more flow. So you can see that in generally high up in the river, we have a lot of flow throughout the year from January to December, and then as you move downstream, you have less and less flow, and in fact, the white illustrates times in which there's no flow whatsoever. When we contrast that to the projected future, I think I just want to illustrate a couple things. One, there'll be much more periods in which there are no flow, so we'll actually have complete drying of the stream. And also the magnitude also varies greatly, in which there will be lower flow, particularly up in the headwaters, where these are really remnant pools of water, which are critically important for organisms. So what does this all mean for aquatic organisms? Well, we know that species exhibit a diversity of life history traits and characteristics, which are related in large part to water requirements across the basin. So today I'm going to be actually talking about 6 critters. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing in on 3 amphibian species which have different dependencies on perennial water. The canyon treefrog is a perennial specialist. Its larval developmental period can be up to 8 weeks, which means that tadpoles must be in water for over an 8-week period to metamorphose into adults. It also is and then the red-spotted toad is more of an intermittent specialist. So its larval period is only about 3 to 6 weeks, and it's less dependent on perennial water. And then Mexican spadefoot is actually a toad, which is an ephemeral specialist. It can emerge from larval to adult within the order of weeks. It also has behavioral and morphological adaptations that allow it to diapause in wet soils for extended periods of time. So it actually is quite more resistant to ephemeral conditions. We see a similar patterning of different aquatic insects across the landscape. I'll be talking about the wonderful giant water bug. This is an organism. It's also called the toe biter. It requires perennial freshwater habitat at all stages. It's also predominantly flightless, so it cannot disperse very far from those water sources. I'll also be talking about a winter stonefly, a Mesocapnia. This organism can actually maintain itself in many intermittent streams, in large part because it can diapause as a larvae in the hyporeic or the kind of the groundwater zone, and then it can emerge when a rain event happens. It also has kind of moderate degrees of dispersal in which that females disperse but males don't. And then finally, there's the diving beetle, which I'll be talking a little bit about. This is a habitat generalist and flies very large distances and can actually be found in small ephemeral puddles of water. So what's neat, or what's interesting, is that when we look from this transition of human water use from perennial to more ephemeral, we can use these aquatic organisms, if you will, as beacons to try to understand what this might mean for entire communities. So we did this. These are the locations of the sampling that we went out to try to get an understanding of what hydrologic connectivity and landscapes mean for the dispersal and the persistence of organisms across the landscape. The majority of the focus was on Fort Huachuca sampling, but again, regional context is really important. So we went to a number of different mountain ranges as well as the valley between them to try to get a handle on these questions. Now, there's a variety of approaches that one can use to try to understand how hydrologic conditions and landscape connectivity means for organisms. The reality is that present-day distribution patterns of species, so if we went out and sampled them right now, reflects only really recent environmental conditions. That is, environmental conditions that have happened over the last 1 to 5 years, but it tells us very little about longer-term patterns of habitat connectivity. So for this reason, we're interested in looking at patterns of gene flow using highly variable nuclear markers, so referred to as microsatellites. This provides us an opportunity to use the genetics to give an idea of dispersal over time frames of multiple decades, which is kind of a better and more realistic understanding of what habitat connectivity means for the longer-term persistence of these organisms. So we went out and sampled a variety of habitats. Some were the beautiful streams that I showed you students often stuck me into the more undesirable habitats like these stock ponds. These are the students that were involved that are really the driving force behind this research. Merrill Mims doing some measurements of amphibian species there. Kristen Yeager was really involved with all the hydrologic modeling. And this is the co-PI, Dave Lytle, who was really instrumental to this project, which was really spearheading all the invertebrate work. So these are really quick. These are the predictions of what we'd expect to see based on those life history characteristics that I just talked about. Again, this is a gradient from perennial specialist to ephemeral. And given this, our understanding, we would expect to have very different predictions about the landscape genetics. That is, organisms that are generally more restricted in their movement and that are freshwater or water specialists, that is, they require perennial waters. We'd expect the genetics to show that they would have very distinct groups. These colors indicate large genetic differences between these populations. But as we go down to better dispersing species and species that can handle more intermittent streams, we might expect that there'd be greater gene flow, say, between different river systems, all the way down to generalist ephemeral species with high dispersal, in which we expect maybe there'd be totally panmixtic. That means that there would basically be no difference genetically between any of the populations. So with these predictions in mind, I'm going to just show you a series of slides going through each of the species, focusing in on what evidence we have for the degree of genetic mixing. Throughout this talk, I'm going to be talking about an overall measure of genetic differentiation between populations. So I'll be using, talking about a value called a GST value. This gives us an overall measure of how genetically distinct populations are. It ranges from 0 to 1. 1 meaning that all populations are genetically distinct, and that means there's very little gene flow or dispersal of organisms between populations, all the way down to a GST value of 0, which means it's panmixtic, very high degree of gene flow, and a high degree of dispersal among populations. So let's start off with this beautiful organism, the canyon tree frog. All of the slides I'm going to be showing you are structured as such. On the left is kind of a reiteration of its water specialist. And then on the right basically just shows you encircle those populations which have the highest degree of genetic similarity. So overall, there's actually a high degree of genetic structure for canyon tree frog. This is shown by a GST value of 0.57. And in large part, you can see the circles are all really small, indicating that there's a high degree of genetic similarity at very small spatial scales. That is, populations are very distinct. Next, I want to focus in on the red-spotted toad. This was the intermittent species. What we can see is that GST value decreases. That shows that there's a larger degree of dispersal or genetic mixing between these populations. And in fact, you can see that now larger groups or populations are all more genetically similar, even across more broad geographic regions, indicating that over the multiple decades, there has been gene flow or potential movement between these areas. And then finally, focusing in on the Mexican spadefoot. Again, this is a more ephemeral kind of specialist, and you can see that the GST value is very low. This indicates that there's a high degree of genetic mixing and a high potential degree of dispersal across all these populations. So if we revisit our predictions, next I just want to focus in on the aquatic insect species. So again, focusing in on Abetus, which is a specialist, Mesocapnia for intermittent, and then Borconectes, which is a diving beetle, which is more of ephemeral. So I think the power of the study that we did here is that we are using traits as a currency, but looking across multiple taxonomic groups to test just how well we can use traits to predict the degree of gene flow. So these are the insect study populations. You can see, again, they went from the Huachucas to the Santa Ritas, all the way up to the whetstones and the mules. So it's the same geographic extent. Rather than showing the detailed results, I'm just going to show the single GST values, but again, focusing, just showing you what these organisms look like. Here's the giant water bug. quite a remarkable organism. Those are all eggs on the back of males, which actually show 100% parental care. So they're actually tasked with keeping those eggs alive. This is the Arizona stonefly. And then this is the Borconectes, this is the diving beetle. So if we just go back again to the same conceptual figure, previously I showed you these values to the right for the amphibian species. And what's remarkable is that we see a very similar pattern as predicted across the aquatic insects, where we have perennial specialists showing the highest degree of genetic structuring, so the most limited degree of gene flow or dispersal, followed by Mesocapnia, followed by the diving beetle. So what does this all mean with respect to the actual landscape of movement? Many of you might have grown up playing Sega. I sure did. One of my favorite games was Frogger. You know, the general aspect here is that I had to get this poor little frog from here to here. And the fact is that the resistance of this landscape obviously was cars trying to run me over. But within an ecological context, landscape resistance to movement, there's a many of different factors which contribute to that. So here are some maps just showing aquatic potential as it's related to precipitation, going from low resistance to high. So the riverbed is shown in red, so it's a very low resistance to movement. Whereas as you move outside the river and it gets dry, there's higher resistance to movement for amphibians. Elevation has a similar pattern. Obviously, some organisms cannot move over high mountain divides. So what we did is that we took a series of different ecologically relevant environmental resistant layers to ask how well do they do predicting those patterns of gene flow between all of those populations that I just reported on. We would predict that those species that showed lower degree of gene flow, that means a lower degree of movement between them, would also show higher degrees of environmental resistance due to these factors. We did the same type of process here. It didn't show up. Basically, across the top here are amphibians and bug species that go from perennial to ephemeral specialists. These are each of the models that I showed previously in terms of the population genetics. And these are just hypothesized landscape drivers that we'd expect to be the most predictive of those patterns in gene flow. We know that species like canyon treefrog and different insects actually require aquatic habitat, so we'd expect that precipitation and the presence of ponds would best explain gene flow, whereas other ephemeral specialists are more panmixtic, so we expect them to actually show little patterns or be just as you increase distance between the populations, you have lower and lower amounts of gene flow. I won't show you the gory details, but what I've done here is highlighted the statistical evidence that we have for each one of these models across each of the species. And again, this is highly rewarding. This shows you that as predicted based on the trait attributes of these organisms, we actually can confer what the likely landscape drivers are influence dispersal among these populations. And many of these landscape drivers are obviously directly within a management context, also differentially susceptible to climate change. So when we think about how we respond to some of these challenges in the future. So just in terms of a quick summary, what I've done here is highlighted the fact that I'm characterizing, the influence of species ecology and the landscape on genetic connectivity or gene flow of populations is really fundamental to how we understand how organisms use the landscape. And it's really important in terms of the longer-term conservation of aquatic organisms. We find that, in fact, ecological traits provide one such way of generalizing across species potentially to talk about how these connections between landscape connectivity and dispersal play out across at regional scales. So we know through climate change that we're likely to see transitions from perennial to intermittent habitats, and I'll talk a little bit about that also in the second part of my talk. This is really going to result in local extinctions of those aquatic specialists, so that is canyon tree frogs and the giant water bug, or species that are going to be highly susceptible to those losses. On the other hand, increases in intermittent habitat when might actually be beneficial for other species, such as red-spotted toad or the Arizona stonefly, and allow them to expand into new areas. But unfortunately, we also know that the increase in ephemeral habitats are really going to be limiting gene flow for many of these organisms that are required to travel along water distances to make those connections. Now, obviously, this varies depending on which organisms that you look at. Many aquatic insects travel overland, so actually flowing water is less important for them. So it's just really this combination of kind of in-stream habitat as well as the surrounding landscape and what that means for dispersal ability and persistence across these landscapes. We showed that we can use traits as an inferential tool to help inform conservation efforts where single species genetic studies aren't possible. The reality is that these studies are expensive to do and time consuming. But if the species that we picked are really model representatives of a diverse kind of co-distributed invertebrate and amphibian fauna in the study region. And by looking at these along these gradients, we can use these traits to try to infer what degree of gene flow is likely for other organisms across the landscape. And this just transitions me into the last slide for this section, is that we can actually use this understanding to try to make these connections. So what I've shown here is just a conceptual figure which shows the degree of water dependence on the x-axis, and these are the organisms that we just talked about previously, and then scaled them along a gradient of dispersal ability from low to high. So we know that landscape genetics provide a really awesome opportunity to actually show that gradation of the importance of these different factors. And then we can superimpose those species in which we haven't done the detailed studies, but we know their dispersal abilities, shown in gray, to try to have an indication of what are the likely on the top major drivers of their persistence across the landscape in terms of allowing them to respond to environmental change through dispersal. So for example, at the local scale, if populations are highly isolated, then we know we need to prioritize local threats and actually manage individual ponds or habitats on the landscape. If it's more intermediate, then we know that there is a degree of gene flow between different populations, and that is important. So looking within a metapopulation, that is multiple populations interacting, and identifying source populations, i.e. the ones that are most important for recruitment and reproduction, and restoring the connections or the corridors between them is going to be a very important management strategy. And then finally, for those ones that are very panmixtic, that means they're very highly dispersed. Then we know that losing individual populations might not be a big deal in the long run, and that we can manage these species at more regional scales. That is, it might be specific DoD-based management, but it's more working with partners surrounding military lands, which is likely to be the most important. For that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julian. We have received a number of questions for you. This is one from Cal EPA. Can you please remind us if invertebrate species are the preferred prey for amphibian species within each habitat group?
Great question. So invertebrates in these habitats provide a number of ecological roles. One is, being direct prey. And larval forms of amphibians are going to be consuming invertebrates, yes. Fish, although not in all of these habitats, but generally in more of these isolated pockets, invertebrates are very important prey for them. So there are kind of these food web level interactions that are important. A side note is that in some of these more isolated headwater ponds and tanahas, invertebrates actually can be the top predator. So I illustrated the Abetus, which is that perennial specialist, the first aquatic insect, that actually is a top predator in these systems. So their presence actually structures food webs. So once we start losing those within particular habitats, that is also going to be a significant. So yeah, there's lots of kind of broader ecosystem implications of their loss.
Great, thank you. Can you please describe the sensors you used in the dry riverbed monitoring in more detail, and tell us if you fabricate them, and also how long they last and how they are maintained?
Sure, yep, happy to do that. So yeah, these sensors they're actually relatively new. There's some folks in 2002 which kind of first developed them. So they were basically, at the time we modified them. So we modified the temperature logger shown in the upper left there to basically, so we separated the wires within them so that we could look at a measure of an increase in signal connectivity between the two wires. So in wetted soils, you'd actually see a spike in connectivity. So we modified them based on previous protocols at the time, and we've actually ourselves in the postdoc in the program with another student have now come up with protocols, written protocols, to actually how you do that, both using the tidbit sensors that are shown there as well as the hobo sensors, which are cheaper. So that's also even something, if anyone's interested, they can reach out to me and I can connect them with those guidelines. But in general, those tidbits are $125 each. The hobos are about $50 each. And this provides, I think, a way to have a very broad network of being able to track at least surface flow hydrology kind of in short time periods, things that we can't do either by physically mapping it, by walking the stream bed.
Thank you so much. This is another question from EPA. Can you suggest any steps that that facilities might take to mitigate regulatory risk, assuming current climate projections?
Okay, so if I understand that correctly, I mean, regulatory risk, I guess, with respect to losing particular habitats. So
in particular, exposure of O&M to ESA.
Yeah. So the organisms that obviously we looked at, none of them are listed under ESA. So that wasn't quite an issue. I think, but they speak to species that are. So I think, for example, Characara leopard frog is in the region. It's ESA listed as threatened, and it's a perennial specialist. There's issues with obviously handling with and studying at large scale many of ESA listed species. And here, at least we provided a tool that there might be opportunities to use surrogate species, at least to get a back-of-the-envelope understanding of the drivers as well as the degree of gene flow across the landscape. So in this case, using Canyon treefrog, but in the next section, I'll be talking about using Arizona treefrog as one example of that. So, it speaks to that. It also speaks to what are the most important habitats which connect landscapes. And those habitats obviously are going to be the most important for monitoring as well as to prevent extinction of species, ESA or not, if they occur there.
Thank you. A question from the University of Montana. Can networks of resistance sensors be used to link to existing stream gauge networks?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's some complementary aspects to that, right? The challenge is with stream gauge networks, there are USGS and those gauges are put in predominantly in regular and perennial waters. So, and that's where, when we started working in these systems, quickly realized that there's a large knowledge gap with respect to all the other surrounding intermittent and ephemeral streams. So, yes, networks of sensors can definitely be coupled with stream gauge networks. We use them to kind of validate the sensitivity of our resistant sensors to flow. But I think the two are kind of telling complementary information. In the sense that, stream gauge networks will tell us discharge or stage So it gives us quantitative measures of flow, whereas our resistance sensors are telling us simply, is it wet or dry? So the two are actually, really important and provide kind of both complementary aspects of information.
Thank you. Another question from US EPA. Do the species traits you use to evaluate dispersal ability for conservation status reflect their importance in ecosystem functions and ecosystem services provided?
Yeah, so that's great. So there's two, traits basically can be separated into two different categories, if you will. One is what we call response traits, so traits which respond to environmental change. So, for example, or allow species to change to environmental change. So, for example, we talked about dispersal ability or water dependency. So, and then the other category of traits are what we call effect traits. Those are traits of species which typically define the effect they have or the role that they play in ecosystems, both in terms of functioning, but also potentially in terms of providing goods or services. Many of those traits are actually often very similar. So what we find is that those traits which basically define how a species changes to an environment also affects its ability to provide those services. So one can imagine that suites of traits can be used to try to understand not only which species might respond negatively to, say, loss of connectivity across the landscape, but also what the implications of the loss of that species would be in a larger ecosystem context.
Thank you so much. Another question, can you tell us what the implications of groundwater pumping and water diversions for aquatic habitats in the region? What are the implications of those, please?
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Fort Huachuca happens to be, kind of ground zero for some of these challenges, but I think it's also representative of different areas. In Fort Huachuca case, there's, the pumping or continued push to pump water from Huachuca Canyon as well as potentially Garden Canyon down to Tombstone and other growing communities. And so the challenge is what does this mean overall for the hydrologic budget? In many cases, groundwater pumping or diversions might result in complete dewatering of essential ponds, and those ponds might be really important for connecting landscapes. But really, the more diffuse groundwater pumping is really going to often lead to more pronounced and prolonged stream drying over large stretches of river. So, now that we know that for some of these organisms, those aquatic corridors are critical in terms of allowing gene flow. And again, gene flow and dispersal is really important. This provides rescue opportunities for when local extinction does occur. Individuals can get there. It also gives an influx of genes, right? The material upon which selection and evolution occurs, and that provides longer-term resistance of these populations to adapt to and show change and respond to climate and other environmental change. So, understanding that some of the groundwater pumping and just climate change in general may actually preclude the exchange of individuals is an important thing to consider.
Thank you. And one last question before we wrap up this Q&A session and move on to the rest of your presentation. This question is also from EPA. Is there a central database or clearinghouse where the flow duration data from the study and potentially other studies is available?
Yeah, no, great question. So we have, and actually just in the process of finishing up the ER sensor data that we have for Fort Huachuca and surrounding basins. So that was over a 3 or 4 year period in which we have that data. There's also other SERDP funded projects that were also involved in the same call, which also were collecting similar like data. And there is an effort and continued conversation about putting this together and getting it within a kind of a central depository. So yeah, that's kind of stay tuned if that's the best way to say that, but that's definitely on the to-do list.
Thank you so much, Jillian. We'll let you proceed with your presentation, and then we'll take more questions at the end of the webinar. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thanks for sticking with me, folks. The second half, I just wanted to provide an opportunity to kind of dive down into some more recent work that we've been doing and ongoing work, focusing in on one particular species that falls across that continuum, if you will, of dispersal or water dependence, and really kind of diving into kind of what the implications of habitat loss might be. So for this section, I want to be talking a little bit about a distinct population segment of the Arizona tree frog. So Arizona tree frog it's pictured right there on the right. This is, again, as I mentioned, a more perennial specialist in terms of extended larval developmental time. And then therefore, it's very sensitive, potentially sensitive to drying of ponds due to climate change or pumping of water. But on the flip side, also of active management, since it currently occurs in a number of stock ponds and ponds that are filled for water to support livestock activities. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity, and that is definitely going to be a theme that I'm going to be talking a lot about over the next 15 minutes. So on the lower right just shows the map of the current distribution of Arizona tree frog. What's really interesting is that there's distinct north and south populations, and then there's what's called the Huachuca group. So some recent work by others have kind of shown that this is a genetically distinct group, and therefore likely this landscape operates as kind of a meta-population of different connected aquatic patches. You can see that the range is very small and therefore very sensitive to regional changes in climate, as well as other activities, as well as outbreaks of disease, and that's something I'll talk a little bit about in a second. And also, it happens to fall very in Fort Huachuca and surrounding lands, so this is a case where DoD really has an obligation and an opportunity to be a leader in how we conserve landscapes for this potential organism. So this question was asking, what are the implications of habitat loss for the Arizona tree frog? So we wanted to evaluate the response to or understand how human-induced reductions in breeding habitat and recruitment success. So that is, where is available water for breeding? And then once breeding occurs, what is the likelihood of having of recruitment success? That is large success as well as large numbers of recruits or larvae, which ultimately become adults. So on the left, on the bottom there, I've just showed kind of what typically can happen seasonally, where we have large stock pond environments shown here, and then these are often dry up to small little puddles and can even disappear on the landscape. Quite honestly, this can occur both naturally in response to climate, but also it can occur due to direct operations on DoD lands, which might basically promote the loss of water in particular areas. So I'm going to be showing some results of using an individual-based modeling as well as some real kind of simple simulations. So simulations and individual-based modeling is really an exciting place to try to answer these questions, because it enables us to look at what are the responses of an organism to a range of environmental stressors. And this is particularly important when we can't experimentally manipulate landscapes, or it's impossible to have large-scale observational approaches. So here we used HexSim as kind of which is a modeling simulation platform. The most important thing I wanted to convey here is that this is an individual-based approach. We're tracking individual frogs as they move across the landscape, as they utilize different ponds, and how they respond to the resistance or the ability to move across landscapes. Therefore, it's spatially explicit, which is very important from a management point of view when operations occur sporadically across the landscape. And it's driven by life history and demographic inputs. So what I mean by that, birth and death rates, breeding success, clutch sizes, all things that can be readily informed by the literature, but then also generalized to other species. So the first thing that we did was say, what is the essential habitat, that is these pond habitats, how important, how are they changing through time on the landscape? From just spending a lot of time in these environments, as anyone of you have been in this region knows, is that a lot of these systems kind of dry and re-wet sporadically. So what we are interested in doing is we use Google Earth satellite imagery archives to get an idea of what the permanence of ponds were across the landscape throughout time. And these ponds were the ponds that are used by Arizona Treefrog. So this is just one pond shown from 1992 all the way to present days. And you can see this is a real ebb and flow of available habitat, where you go from relatively wet to dry, to wet again, to completely dry, all the way to a wet pond again. So these are very highly dynamic systems, and we utilize this imagery for every pond to actually have pond-specific drying rates and likelihood of persisting into the future. The model, I just want to break down simply into 4 steps. But again, we're kind of tracking individual movements, so we know where Arizona tree frogs are on the landscape, as well as an approximation of initial population size. We can see that landscape, so we basically just plop frogs down on the landscape. And we know their likelihood to move to different ponds based on their degree of dispersal. We know the resistance of the landscape, as I showed in the first section, with respect to how easily they can move between different ponds. Then they're allowed to provide the opportunity to reproduce, and potentially, if given the opportunity, complete metamorphosis into adults. Then there's this probability of overwintering and then growing, and then there's mortality in terms of non-breeding mortality that occurs throughout populations, both in terms of drying as well as just natural mortality rates. A lot of these ponds, obviously, not everyone survives in these ponds. So this is kind of an iterative process which goes back and forth, and we can track it through time, basically looking at where frogs are populating different ponds through time and how that might change under a number of different scenarios. And we looked at 5 different scenarios which are basically indicative of alternative futures that we expect to see under either climate change or dewatering or mismanagement, if you will, of ponds across the landscape. So first is the baseline. This is just assuming that all breeding ponds are available and all breeding ponds have the potential for recruitment. So success is 100%. We then looked at 4 different scenarios of drying where we basically systematically either reduced breeding pond availability. So what's neat about this is that we knew which breeding ponds through the Google imagery were more likely to dry through time than others. So we could actually then just dry them on the landscape through these scenarios and then look at the implications of what that means for overall populations of Arizona tree frog. Again, this is a realistic scenario that if they are in the past sensitive to climate fluctuations, in the future they're likely also to be sensitive to climate. In these cases, we kept recruitment at 100%. And then we looked at cases in which we basically affected recruitment success. So that might be that the pond is smaller, therefore recruitment success decreases even though water is still there. And then we looked at, and the last scenario, scenario 4, was basically the combination of the two, kind of the worst case scenario. So just in terms of coloration as we move forward, we basically go from blue being good to this weird red color being really bad with respect to a drying scenario. So this is just the first result I want to show. The general take-home message is that drought conditions do threaten Arizona tree frog populations. On the x-axis is the number of generations through time. So that's basically our time axis. On the y-axis is the overall population size. So that's the total number of adult frogs across the landscape of breeding ponds. So this is basically across the ponds, which are really surrounding the Huachuca Mountains, both on and off base. So the first thing I want to illustrate here is that you can see through time the baseline shown in blue. So it's pretty stable and hovers around 2,000 to 2,500 individuals. But as you increase drying, going from basically this peach color all the way to red, you can see that there's greater and greater losses in overall population size. So what this means is that as you decrease pond availability and influence recruitment, you see lower and lower population size. In fact, a population size of half under these extreme scenarios. And again, given this distinct population in the Huachucas, and also the fact that it has a very limited geographic extent of that distribution, a potential halving of population size obviously is something of concern. Again, this is a scenario based, but it gives us a little idea of what to expect. This is showing, maybe more relevant also from a management perspective, is the same figure but looking at the number of ponds occupied through time, and that's on the y-axis. Again, generations on the x. And I'm just showing the baseline and then the two extreme scenarios. Scenario 1, which has a 70% pond availability and 100% recruitment success versus 70 and 30. So the most extreme case where we're losing ponds and we're losing recruitment. So kind of what I want to show you is that after a prolonged drought and the loss of these ponds, as well as reductions in recruitment, you can see that overall the number of ponds occupied is quite low. So again, through time, where we might expect a gradual but subtle increase in the amount of ponds occupied in the baseline condition, and this is natural as frogs move around, explore the landscape, and occupy new ponds, we actually see a flat line of ponds occupied within the two drought scenarios. So anywhere on the order, or on average around 10 to 15 ponds being occupied. And obviously then those are focal areas for management and conservation into the future. And what you can also see is that in this scenario, 70% pond availability is constant, but we see a reduction in recruitment. So in many cases, although definitely the loss of ponds is important, the reduction in recruitment is also very important. And again, that can occur both because of environmental conditions, but also might occur because of a variety of other factors, which I'll talk about in 2 slides. So if we just map that across the landscape, this is what it looks like. So what I've shown here, here are the Huachuca Mountains right here. Fort Huachuca there is in the eastern flanks where there's actually, there's just the odd populations just over the ridgeline. But what you can see here is that each of these symbols is a pond, and this is the percent time occupied for 100 generations, and that's represented by symbol size. So as it increases in symbol size and intensity and becomes more dark blue, that means it's a higher percent occupancy. So those are really more of the core, the keystone ponds, if you will, with respect to the persistence of these species. Black ponds, and then black are the ones that were never occupied. Baseline is on the left, which shows that we have a nice collection of ponds. Some are more important, than others in this landscape. But then this is in direct contrast to the right, which shows the drying scenario where you can see now we only have a handful of ponds that are available and that persist in terms of supporting tree frog populations through time. And also what's most troubling, again, within this scenario context, is that some of these clusters are quite geographically isolated, in which that we have clusters of them, as opposed to a more continuous kind of mosaic where gene flow most likely would occur between these ponds. Okay, so what does this mean? What is the consequences of this? Well, fewer available ponds obviously concentrate a lot of things. One, there's going to be greater competition for resources within those ponds. And the aquatic resources within those ponds, namely invertebrates and other prey bases, are actually going to be a lot more stressed with respect to trying to support recruitment within those areas. Also, disease risk such as chytrid fungus and others that are actually, a very important issue throughout this region. If there's less populations, that means there's less of a populations which might resist or recolonize or provide sources to recolonize through time during these disease outbreaks. And then finally, there's much higher risk also predation. Many of these ponds contain bullfrogs. This is a wonderful photo here to the lower right. Those little mounds are not mounds of mud. Those are bullfrogs hanging out in a stock pond. So these are all risks and consequences of having more isolated and less ponds to support these populations of Arizona tree frog. Also, less ponds means less long-term resilience because these ponds are highly sensitive to catastrophic losses or basically elimination from the landscape. So wildfires is a big issue. The photo on the lower right was the Monument Fire, which we were doing work down there at the time. This was kind of a very large fire during a very active fire season a couple years ago. This then ultimately this was then followed by high precipitation events, which led to large flooding and debris flows. On the right there, the arrow shown here, this right here used to be a very large pond in Miller Canyon, which is just south of Fort Huachuca. And it was a very important pond for amphibians, and that pond now no longer exists because of debris flow. So again, there's a real ephemeral nature of some of these ponds, and this is obviously really important if we identify those as being critical for the longer-term persistence of the species. So how might these results start to inform management options across the landscape? Again, these are simulations, and they're not supposed to reflect reality, but they are ecologically derived and provide a good indication of the relative importance of different ponds across the landscape, in this case in terms of the conservation of Arizona tree frog. So individual ponds that are particularly important, we can manage them to try to maintain aquatic habitat within them. So on the lower right there is a stock pond showing basically the difference between a pond in which livestock has access to, in which they come down and they graze and then basically access the water to the left, versus a pond which has been fenced off from livestock. And you can see obviously vegetation-wise, very different, and that provides different and important habitat for amphibians. Also, we often see that there's less water availability sometimes in those cases in which cattle are fenced off, in large part because by trampling the water in the near shore, they actually keep this water available and open for amphibians. So like most things in ecology and conservation, everything isn't straightforward. This is kind of precarious balance, if you will, between maybe some degree of grazing or active management to keep ponds available and open for amphibians versus very poor water quality and habitat destruction, which happens when you have hundreds of livestock occupying these ponds. There's also very active efforts to remove bullfrogs from many of these ponds. This is done by removing tadpoles, as well as in the center panel showing basically bullfrogs getting shot and killed and removed basically via sniper to take these organisms out of these habitats. So we were privileged enough to kind of work with some of these efforts so we can look at the response of some of these ponds to bullfrog removal. Bullfrogs obviously compete with and can directly predate upon native amphibians. So understanding how we manage the landscape for bullfrogs and control them or stop them from spreading is super important. And then lastly, just shown on the right is that much like how human activities can eliminate ponds, active human management can also create ponds in the landscape. So the question is there critical areas in the landscape where we might want to create and intentionally water and maintain ponds in areas which maintain connectivity between populations maybe in those areas where ponds are going to be lost because of climate change? Or can we actively manage to try to prevent water loss from existing ponds, especially those that are critical for maintaining population numbers for some of these amphibian species of interest? So there's a whole variety of more active, more passive restoration approaches to ponds, as well as some more active restoration approaches, as I've illustrated in the bottom panel here, which need to be traded off when we think about how we manage in the future. And we've provided just a spatial model to try to guide or help answer the question of where and when some of these activities might want to occur in the future. So in conclusion, I just want to, I hope I've kind of convinced that landscape genetics is a rapidly changing and evolving field, but now has a really deep history and has a lot to contribute with respect to how we inform conservation planning. The reality is, though, is that it's still a more time, although becoming more cost effective, it still takes money, it still takes time, and I hope I've convinced that we might be able to use existing trait-based inferences to try to extrapolate from multi-species genetic studies like the 6 species I've shown you to more entire community-based approaches where we're talking about dozens of species, to just talk about really at what point does landscape genetics provide important additional information, and what broad-scale conservation activities do we need to do with respect to local scale management or more regional scale management, i.e. do management efforts at an individual base really matter versus working more broadly with stakeholders and land holdings surrounding DoD lands to try to conserve these species. And then finally, I've just shown you the one example of a real a specific case study for Arizona Treefrog, where we've tried to identify the actual at the patch or the pond level, those areas which are most critical for the long-term persistence of these species, and some of the management or portfolio of management options that might be available to try to conserve the species into the future. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions, but I truly want to acknowledge my collaborator and friend, Dr. David Lytle from Oregon State University. Both of us have worked equally on this project. We had a whole team of graduate students and postdocs and undergrads, and we've also very benefited well from the other 3 SERDP-funded projects under this Arid Land Dryland Stream initiative, which I think really speaks to the power of SERDP for supporting coordinated projects around certain topic areas, because I think a lot of important research and synergy that occurred between our groups, and I think pushed each one of our research projects in ways in which we were all punching well above our weight that we wouldn't have been doing if we were just working alone. So I think this is some links for the additional information. I'm always available by phone or email, and happy to talk to anyone about this effort or other efforts that we're doing. And with that, happy to take any questions. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Julian. I would like to remind our audience to submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of the screen. We have received additional questions for you. Can you please tell us if amphibians are using man-made ponds, and if so, what are their potential roles in conservation activities that occur on Fort Huachuca?
Yes. What we're finding on the western side of the Huachucas, where the majority of populations are right now, they're predominantly using man-made ponds. There's some headwater stretches, mainly kind of where water is more permanent on top of bedrock, habitats of tanahas, et cetera, in which can be really important. But in general, man-made ponds are very important. When we just jump over the ridge, high mountain ridges, onto Fort Huachuca, I think we see less Arizona treefrog there, but nevertheless, as you kind of move downstream, there's definitely kind of a variety of habitats. It happens on Fort Huachuca that there's some very large permanent ponds. These are what are called gentlemen fishing ponds, which were created a long time ago, which have sport fish in them as well as invasive crayfish, but that's another topic that I'd love to talk about. And these are really hotspots for a bullfrog, but they're also potential sinks because when amphibians come to those habitats, they're essentially, recruitment is very low because of high predation pressure from non-natives. So man-made ponds are super important. What we're also finding is that military operations often inadvertently create ponds, particularly when basically ground is getting moved and basically berms are being created, and then during monsoon rain events, water is being supported for different levels. And I would say there's a kind of a missed opportunity there is that in many of these cases, if the idea was to try to maintain or create some of these ponds because they are deemed to be in really important locations on the landscape, very probably slight modifications to how those berms are created might increase hydrologic residency time, i.e. water will hang around for longer, and that they might serve more important ecological roles. So I think there's really unique opportunities to think about ways strategically not to completely engineer landscapes, but think about where areas on the landscape might be where military operations might have the co-benefits, given additional effort of also trying to support amphibian breeding locations.
Thank you. What other military operations may affect the persistence of amphibians on DoD lands?
Yeah, Fort Huachuca, as well as many other DoD lands, often have a wide variety or network of roads, which obviously provide access to different training grounds. And what we're finding is that roads provide an interesting paradigm, if you will, in some ways. So roads across the landscape provide a couple of negative effects in such that they often fragment the landscape, and they can often reduce the movement of organisms between different habitat patches. We're also finding that roads often are conduits for water during the monsoon periods, so that they are often, they're often very wet, and they move water through landscapes, but not through the natural river networks. So I would say those are negatives and things to consider with respect to how additional roads are used. But on the other hand, the ditches along roadsides, when created, often do hold water for extended periods, particularly into the summer dry season. And what we're finding, and a lot of places in which we were collecting amphibians across the landscape was by actually collecting them from roadside ditches. So that begs the question, many of those habitats might suddenly be important for amphibians, but the way in which then military vehicles use those roads to try to minimize damage on those newly created habitats is, I think, something that would have to be considered at a base level.
Great, thank you. A question from the University of Montana. How critical is riparian vegetation for defining the habitat of the amphibians and invertebrates that you described today?
Yeah, extremely important. That's a good question. One that I failed to really illustrate is that riparian habitat and buffers around these systems are really important in many ways, both in terms of increasing residence time of water. So basically by slowing water down and allowing it to actually maintain in the stream channel. They're very important for stream temperature. As we all know, shading will then reduce solar radiation, which then basically reduces evaporation of water along many of these areas. They also provide corridors for amphibians to move along the river, because they often don't move in the riverbed, but they move along the riparian zone. Many of these amphibians too, like canyon treefrog, hence the name canyon, they move up across land. So not only within the riparian vegetation, but also more broadly, how we think across military lands, how we maintain connectivity from ridgeline down to rivers is really important. And I think there's really a lot of good opportunities to maintain some of those habitats. And then aquatic insects, absolutely. As many people might know, aquatic insects, the majority of their time is in water, but then when they emerge as adults, they can spend anywhere from 24 hours to less than a week during aerial dispersal with adults mating. And riparian habitat is very important to allow dispersal away from the river into other systems to basically promote gene flow. So I think there's a real critical role that riparian vegetation continues to play. And even if it looks like these habitats are dry for the majority of the year, the role that they serve, even when they're only wet for a very short amount of time, is critically important.
Great. One last specific question before we start wrapping up. Do the Arizona tree frogs disperse as adults across upland areas? And is it possible to use individual-based models to identify potential corridors or barriers between ponds? And this is a question from the University of Wisconsin.
Wonderful. Thanks. Go Badgers. Yes, fantastic question. What I didn't show with these results is that we track the actual dispersal pathways upon which Arizona tree frogs are getting from one pond to the next. So to answer your question, yeah, and it's a great question, is that we actually have been looking at the types of environments and the actual pathways, and you can multiply that hundreds of pathways across the landscape, and then you can ask, where are the strong conduits of movement? So where are the strong circuitry or the nerves connecting particular ponds across these hundreds of individuals? And we've done that. I didn't show any of the results, but that's then we've done that to identify, yes, are there particular areas, how many roads are crossed, are there particular types of riparian vegetation or other habitats along those particular corridors. So we're not necessarily thinking about, okay, we need to manage the entire landscape for movement, but can we hone into those important conduits for movement of between ponds? So yeah, that's a great question, and yes, definitely a product of these individual-based models.
Great. And as we wrap up here, just one final question. Can you tell us about the next steps of your work and what main message you would like to leave our audience with today, please?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think one of the most important questions that are things that I'd like to stress, and this comes from both not only interactions on Fort Huachuca, but I've done work on White Sands and China Lake and Pendleton and Fort Hunter Liggett, and all these systems that I work in, is that a dry riverbed is not necessarily an unimportant riverbed. Dry rivers are important not only when they're wet, and although again that occurs only during certain periods of time, that is so critically important, but also beyond aquatic organisms, they're very important for terrestrial as well, right? They collect during the dry season organic matter so that then when they re-wet, they're very important for the productivity of systems. Obviously, they're critically important for mammals and other terrestrial organisms which require watering holes. So I guess my sense is that, with respect to monitoring on DoD lands, that, don't forget that the importance of these ephemeral and intermittent systems. They are definitely the rule, not the exception. But despite that, they continue not to get as much attention with respect to research and conservation. And yeah, I think that'd be my main message, is that there's great opportunities to actually take both passive and active restoration efforts on DoD lands. I think the one thing that we've shown from the Sky Island complex is that even mountain ranges that are seemingly far away play a very important role in how they shape one another. So again, stressing the importance of different bases working with surrounding land partners to think about regional scale conservation activities, and then how they coordinate local scale activities to basically support those initiatives, I think is super important.
Great. Thank you so much, Julian, for a phenomenal job. I'd like to remind our audience at this time that our next webinar is on Thursday, March 9, and it will feature an award-winning, actually 2 award-winning SERDP and ESTCP projects in the Environmental Restoration Program area. We will have 2 speakers from the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center, Dr. Andy Martin and Dr. Steve Larson, who will talk about grenade range management and erosion control of protective berms, respectively. Registration is already open for this webinar, so please visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register for this and other future webinars. Before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it at this time if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you for your time.